In the 1950s and 1960s, nonviolent activists in the civil rights movement led the fight for equality and justice. For decades, African Americans had been subjected to racial discrimination, especially in the South. Those who protested against this injustice encountered brutal attacks from white supremacists. Civil rights activists faced great danger in their pursuit of equality in the South, where racism was so deeply ingrained in the way of life. Some progress was made in the 1950s, but by the middle 1960s, hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the South still lacked one of our most basic rights, the right to vote. The 15th Amendment, ratified back in 1870, prohibited racial discrimination in voting, but this ban was widely ignored across the South. Literacy tests blocked many uneducated African Americans from being able to register to vote. Poll taxes prevented poor African Americans from voting. Those who tried to register or vote often faced harassment and abuse, and sometimes arrest. In 1964, a group of college students called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee staged a major voting rights effort. They called it Freedom Summer. The group enlisted hundreds of volunteers, both black and white, to register African Americans in Mississippi to vote. Some locals did not welcome them.
They saw us as outsiders. They saw us as troublemakers. They saw us as agitators.
Despite the danger, volunteers continued their effort. They taught unschooled African Americans how to read and write, and they coached people on how to fill out voter registration applications correctly. By the end of the summer, the project had helped thousands of African Americans to attempt to register and inspired many more to become politically active. But from the very beginning, the shadow of fear and tragedy loomed over the effort. Before most volunteers had even arrived that summer, 3 civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared. Weeks later, their bodies were found. They had been driven down an old logging road and shot at point-blank range. Not until the fall did investigators learn the names of their murderers. Those men were all members of the Ku Klux Klan, a group willing to use violence to block the civil rights movement. The murder of the 3 civil rights workers captured the attention of the nation. But civil rights leaders were frustrated at the lack of progress in ensuring the voting rights of African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to organize a mass march to push the federal government to act. In March of 1965, activists converged on Selma, Alabama. They planned to march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, demanding voting rights.
The right to vote is so fundamental in democracy. So Selma was a campaign about something very fundamental that occurred at a time when the movement had a very high profile.
On Sunday, March 7, 1965, a group of protesters set out across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the main route out of Selma. However, Alabama Governor George Wallace, a segregationist, had ordered state police to prevent the marchers from leaving the city. On what became known as Bloody Sunday, state troopers beat and tear-gassed the nonviolent protesters, preventing them from crossing the bridge. John Lewis was one of the marchers.
I can still hear the moans, the groans, and people crying out for help as they were being trampled by horses and the tear gas was burning in their eyes. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick, and I felt like this was the last demonstration for me. To this day, I don't know how I made it back across that bridge, back through the streets of Selma, back to the little church that we had left from.
News coverage of the violence shocked the nation.
That really marked the civil rights movement coming of age.
King called for ministers of all races and faiths to join a second attempt at marching out of Selma. Reverend James Reeb, a white Unitarian minister from Washington, D.C., heeded the call. He was an ardent supporter of the civil rights movement and was appalled by the violence of Bloody Sunday. Reeb joined 2,000 others who aimed to attempt that second march, but a federal judge ordered the march be postponed because of the violence that had occurred. King agreed to the order, but the marchers carried out a symbolic protest. On March 9th, they marched across the bridge. When they were met by state troopers, they knelt in prayer and then turned around to go back across the bridge. That evening, Reverend Reeb was attacked by 3 white men. 2 days later, he died.
I think it affected people in the South. I think Christian people looked at a minister being beaten to death and thought, this may not be Christian what people are doing against these black people. I think it planted some seeds of fairness.
A few days after Reeb's death, on March 15, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a momentous speech to Congress. He called for a strong federal Voting Rights Act.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
I was sitting next to Dr. King when Lyndon Johnson said, and we shall overcome, and tears came down his face. He cried. I said, we will make it from Selma to Montgomery, and the Voting Rights Act will be passed.
With newfound support and sympathy for their cause, the protesters were committed to finishing the march. Late in March, King led hundreds of people on a 3-day journey to Montgomery. This time, the marchers were protected by federal troops sent by Johnson. On March 25th, marchers arrived in the state capitol, celebrating their success at long last.
We're on the move now. Yes, sir. The beating and killing of our clergymen and young people will not divert us. We're on the move now. Yes, sir.
Dr. King was right. In early August, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Johnson signed it into law. He invited King to attend the ceremony. By banning the use of literacy tests and other barriers, the act removed the main roadblocks that had prevented African Americans from voting. The new law led to great change. In just the first 3 years after its passage, almost 1 million African Americans registered to vote in the South. By the end of the 1960s, African American voters were significantly affecting Southern politics. Although the movement was tinged by tragedy, the activists who took part knew what the risks were, and they knew that their cause was too important to abandon.
We were always determined that freedom was more valuable than life. The dignity was more important than a comfort zone. And when you're on that frequency, then graveyards cannot contain such an idea.
Civil rights activists like John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. fought to win equal rights for African Americans. The effects of their work still live on today. What effect did protests in the South have on the federal government? Why were voting rights an important goal for the civil rights movement?